be able to stop this because it is the most pernicious thing. This makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle.
Get it? Because crows are small and eagles are huge. These new voting laws are the mother lode of racism, apparently. Well, to start off the critique of this insane statement, I guess I'll start by telling you a bit about Alabama. And it comes to mind because I was just there in June for my birthday trip. And Alabama has a deep history with Jim Crow law. I'll also say throughout this video, I'll be relying on leftist-ran information. It won't be some far-right website or Ben Shapiro. All the data I'll be putting up on the screen is by the left. So let's start by a summary of Alabama's voting laws around the turn of the 20th century. The new 1901 Constitution of Alabama included provisions for voter registration that effectively disenfranchised large portions of the population, including nearly all African Americans and Native Americans and tens of thousands of poor whites. The 1901 Constitution required racial segregation of public schools. By 1903, only 2,980 African Americans were registered in Alabama, although at least 74,000 were literate. This compared to more than 181,000 African Americans eligible to vote in 1900. The numbers dropped even more in later decades. While the planter class had persuaded poor whites to vote for this legislative effort to suppress black voting, the new restrictions resulted in their own disenfranchisement as well, due mostly to the imposition of a poll tax. By 1941, whites constituted a slight majority of those disenfranchised by these laws, 600,000 whites versus 520,000 African Americans. Nearly all African Americans had lost the ability to vote. So that was Jim Crow. But the Georgia laws are Jim Eagle? No one could vote under Jim Crow. So what are the new voting laws that are more racist than that? That blacks just have to die? I mean, how could it get worse than Jim Crow? The new Georgia laws ship blacks back to Africa? I mean, what is he talking about? How could it get worse than what it was? And a lot of Jim Crow customs continued informally until challenged in court. And Alabama was at the center of a lot of the national tension over civil rights with events like the Montgomery bus boycotts inspired by Rosa Parks and headed up by MLK. Alabama was slow to give up those old Jim Crow laws, and they unsuccessfully fought tooth and nail to keep those laws in place. So now let's compare that to Georgia's new voting laws and see just how extraordinarily racist this is. Okay, Georgia's new election laws, also known as Senate Bill 202, have stirred much debate across the United States. Republicans have claimed it actually expands voter access, but Democrats have equated it with Jim Crow laws and contend it's more about voter suppression. Both sides have made their claims about the law, but what's actually in the final version? Here's a breakdown of what was signed into law. Voter ID. Georgia voters were already required to present a photo ID when voting in person. Under the new law, voters must now have some form of identification to vote by mail. For most, that identification will either be a driver's license or a state ID card. When a voter applies for an absentee ballot and returns the ballot, electors must include a copy of either the license or state ID card. If the voter does not have one, the law requires them to include a photocopy of another form of accepted ID. If the voter does not have the license or state ID, their date of birth and the last 4 digits of their Social Security must be submitted with their ballot. If the voter does not have a Social Security number, they must include a photocopy of another form of accepted identification. Republicans argue that photo ID is a more objective way to verify a voter's identity than the subjective signature matching process. I love how they use objective and subjective in quotes here. It's so retarded. I just can't get over it. The stupidity here. The just blatant line and the framing is infuriating. Georgians can get a state ID for free, but critics of the law say potential eligible voters who will face hurdles without a license or state ID number are also most likely to lack the alternative documents like a birth certificate, and that would keep them from obtaining a state ID card. Well, good. Then they don't need to vote. If you don't have a birth certificate, if you don't have a state ID, if you don't have any sort of form of identification, then you don't get to vote. If we don't know who you are and you just mail it in and anyone can just put whatever and we don't verify that it was you, that you actually voted, then good. You don't get to vote. Whatever. Ugh. Under Georgia's new law, election officials are not allowed to mail absentee ballot applications to voters unless they request one, meaning that we don't just send a ballot to every single person, meaning you open it up to massive amounts of fraud. Voters can request a ballot starting 78 days before Election Day. The deadline to request a ballot is 11 days. Previously, voters in counties allowed requests to begin 180 days before and last until the Friday before the election. So we closed it up. We don't allow 180 days. What's that? Half a year, 6 months before the election? That's insane. That's on par. That's worse than 520,000 black people just not allowed to vote at all? Okay. Another point of debate is how absentee ballot boxes will work moving forward. In 2020, counties could add absentee ballot drop boxes after an emergency rule enacted by the state election board. The boxes were required to be under 24/7 video surveillance and on government property generally accessible to the public. Governor Kemp said that the new law makes ballot drop boxes an official part of Georgia election law, which is true. The new law requires every county to at least have one drop box. In November 2020, every Georgia county was allowed to, but not required to, have a drop box available to voters. However, there are limits to the drop boxes. Drop boxes can now only be placed inside early voting locations and will be available only during voting hours. Oh, how are black people going to manage this? Oh, they're so stupid and retarded. They could never find out where it's at and what hours it's open. My God! And then we get to early voting. Brian Kemp has argued that the new law expands early voting. It does add an extra Saturday to the previous early voting period and allows counties to offer 2 Sunday voting days as well. However, critics have said that this only helps the rural communities expand voter access and doesn't help the metropolitan areas. That's code for black people, whenever you hear that. Early voting can take place between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. during weekdays, but counties have the option to extend hours to 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. My God! Oh! 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. We all know black people aren't even awake during those hours. They're nocturnal creatures. This is racist. Racist, I say. Early voting has become a point of emphasis for Republican leaders after MLB moved its all-star game from Georgia to Colorado because they will not stand for this, okay? We all know black people don't wake up till 7:01 p.m. and this is racist, okay? And you want, okay, Colorado offers 15 days of early voting compared to Georgia's 17 days of early voting. You see, Colorado's so much better. That's why we got to move there. However, the context of how most people in Colorado vote is important. Colorado has a universal vote-by-mail system, and every active registered voter is automatically mailed a ballot without having to specifically request one. So the fraud is more there, you know? That's why we got to move, out of virtue signaling. That's why we have to move there, because we like more fraud and we hate when there's rules that prevent more fraud. Now we get to the really racist laws, okay? You thought Jim Crow was bad. I mean, there was great migration. Half the population moved out of Alabama over these laws. And these laws are worse, so we're going to see a mass migration, okay? Food and water and voting lines. The law makes it a misdemeanor for people to hand out any money or gifts, including but not limited to food or drink, to anyone standing in line to vote. It applies within 150 feet of a polling place or within 25 feet of any voter at a polling site. Election workers are allowed to set up self-service water stations for voters in line, meaning this isn't about, water. It's not about that. It's about influencing people and influencing their vote. But critics say it would penalize even nonpartisan groups or individuals for something as simple as giving water to someone in a long line. Oh, it's just like Jim Crow. Just like it. So in the broad scheme of things, the simple act of needing to prove who you say you are, to cast a vote is bigger than all of the Jim Crow laws that we looked at before. And I didn't even go through all of them. I just looked at how they affected voting in one state. Now, as Adam Carolla says, this either makes you stupid or a liar. Biden is either so stupid that he thinks that black people don't have IDs, meaning they can't work or rent or own homes or drive cars or buy cigarettes and alcohol or fly on planes or open bank accounts, or he's lying to protect a key aspect of how he got elected. It's voter fraud, and they love it. Voter ID laws are racist, you see? And that's the only reason why Republicans could ever support them. And over, you see that narrative in the media. After every mass shooting, aka any given weekend in Chicago, the typical useful idiots are out there giving their talking points on gun control, which inevitably leads to this stupid line: buying a gun is easier than casting a vote. Again, stupid or liar. Last time I checked, we don't mail free guns to people's homes without background checks, or voter ID, or to verify your identity. This is another feature and not a bug of Opposite Day. It's the most insane and false thing that they could say. And so, of course, it goes straight to the top of the list of things they do say. And we went over the MLB. They got on their high horse about the racist voting laws, and then they moved to Colorado where the voting laws are worse, if we follow their logic. That's the dumbest and most ignorant move they could do, and so, of course, they do it. I haven't focused on Biden that much. I feel he's just a puppet, really. Clearly someone has their hand up his butt, and he doesn't interest me that much because obviously other people are running the show. But I did want to do just a quick comparison and show the stupidity of the whole thing. Anyways, that's all the time I have for today. If you like this video and type of content, consider giving this video a like or maybe subscribing. I'll see you all in the next video. Peace.